Access 2007 Exam Preparation. Many of you may be planning on taking the exam. Microsoft has changed with the new Office 2007 products to offer a certification called the MCAS, Microsoft Certified Application Specialist. The Access 2007 exam is numbered 77-605. The goal of this nugget is to take a look at each exam objective and map that to the CBT nugget that explains that information. I'll also give you some tips for studying. The very first exam topic is structuring a database. We have defined data needs and types as a Microsoft described objective. This maps to the nugget called table properties. Now, as you're looking through here, there's a lot of text. I've given the objective and then the associated nugget. That might seem strange to you that there isn't just one nugget that hits structuring a database. That was very hard to do here in Access because my goal here was to teach you the program from the beginning until the end. And Access is so huge. We have tables, forms, queries, reports, and macros that all make up a whole database solution. And I thought it was best for your learning to hit an object, understand it inside and out, and then put it together with how it relates to the other objects. Access is so huge, and I'm assuming anyone who's taking this exam is really going to try to build a database solution in Microsoft Access. Our next objective is define table relationships. That's in the normalizing data nugget. Adding and changing primary keys is in the intro to tables nugget, and splitting databases is in the database tools. As perhaps you've gleaned from looking at this information, tables are the foundation for anything you're going to do in Access. Tables are where you hold your data, and you are going to want to really put some thought into creating your database. Let's go into Access and do a bit of a review of these objectives. I have the Zoo database open, and I want to take a look at the relationships. So to Database Tools, I can click on the Relationships button. I see here a few tables, and they all have one-to-many relationships. Before I even got started with this, I sat and I thought, what do I need to display in my database? What should those reports be outputting? What type of data do I need to collect from my users, which will be the forms? And how do I best break up my tables so that I'm normalizing them, so that I'm only including information that's reliant on the primary key and makes sense to hold together that I can relate to other tables, and then eventually build a query so that I can pull fields from all these different tables together and see them in a semblance of order that makes sense to a human. Well, let's go ahead and go into design view of animal food so I can talk a little bit about data types. Right from here, I can right-click and choose Table Design. In design view of the table, you see the fields, the data types at the top, and then the properties associated with the item towards the bottom. Food ID is my primary key because I have that key and because primary key is selected here. If I wanted to remove that, I would just simply click to remove the key by clicking on the button. You can't change the primary key because this is in a relationship. That's okay. I could break that relationship in the relationships window, and then I could remove the primary key and select a different primary key by clicking with that button. The primary key means that this field is always going to be unique. There is never going to be a duplicate food ID, and it's a very good idea to have a primary key in every single table. Now, data types. My food ID is auto number because Access is going to come up with the value for food ID automatically. It's just going to be incremented by 1 for each new record. Food name would make sense as text. My field size is 25 because I know I don't want to waste space in my table. When I create forms based off of food name, I don't want to have fields that are too large because Access will accommodate for up to 255 characters in a text field. So I limited this to what I think my food names will generally be smaller than. My quantity in stock is a number. The field size is integer, which is pretty large. That means I could have up to 32,500, and I believe 37 would be the largest number I could hold in this field. If I wanted to, I could make that smaller to byte, which is 255. Neither byte integer or long integer allow for me to have decimal places. So if I knew that I might have a quantity ordered of 5 1/4, I would have to change that to single, double, or decimal. Price, this field of course is currency. And then my vendor, it appears as number, but in fact it is looking up to a table that already exists. I have a vendor's table that indicates the vendor ID is the primary key and then the vendor name. So when I chose the data type as lookup wizard, I went through a wizard and it came up with my data type as number, because your related tables have to have the same data type. And the great thing about a lookup field is if I go back into table view and I find my vendor field, I can choose that my users will see something that makes sense to them. They see Sakana Fresh instead of seeing the ID, which would mean they'd have to refer to some other source of information anyway, because chances are they're not going to memorize the ID for the vendor. They'll know the name of the vendor. So design view of tables is very important. I'm going to close this and let's go back to the objectives. The one item we didn't hit was splitting databases. Back into Access, you can split databases by going to Database Tools, and you have the Split Database command here. Right here, it's under Move Data called Access Database. By splitting a database, you'll then have two files. One that's going to have your source data, where typically you don't want your users in making changes, and then the other will have the queries and the forms, which, yes, it does make sense to have your users being in, making changes, adding criteria to the queries, and entering and editing data in the forms. We can now go back into the objectives. The next set of objectives is creating and formatting database elements. We want to create a database. That's in the very first nugget, Introduction to Access. Creating and modifying tables is in 2, the Introduction to Tables and Table Properties, which we really just discussed when we were in Table Design View. Creating and modifying forms. These are all 3 of our form nuggets: simple forms, designing forms, and advanced forms. Creating and modifying reports are in all 3 of the report nuggets: simple reports, designing reports, and advanced reports. The key to know about forms and reports are that they are going to be based off of your source table. So if you have a combo box in a table, or if you have properties in your table, your form is going to pick those fields up right away. And to create all of these objects, you simply go to the Create tab. Whether you're creating a form or a report, you'll find either the wizard or the basic button that will get you started. Once you're in a form or a report, you can always go into Design View. I can right-click and choose Design View from here. Of course, there's always many ways to do that. A big deal is on this design ribbon, you have all of these various controls. They used to be called the control toolbox in older versions of Access. Each control has its own property sheet, and I'm in a form, but the same goes for a report. So you can modify the various properties of every single control object that you have selected. Something new to Access 2007 is Layout View. In Layout View, you can make some basic formatting changes. Notice you don't have a Design tab with all of those extra controls, but something that's nice is you do actually see the data as it will exist. So it helps you to resize fields if you need to and know whether or not you're going to truncate some of the text. Back to this outline, we have completed the Creating and Formatting Database Elements review. Of course, I recommend going through every single one of these nuggets. In the Entering and Modifying Data objective, this is about working with data, whether it be entering, editing, and deleting records, which you can do in the table, the query, or the form, finding and replacing data, most often done in the form because your users will be doing this, and it's the same find and replace dialog box that you may be used to in other Office products. It has not changed here in Access 2007 if you're used to older versions of Access. Attaching documents to records is something that can be pretty fantastic, and importing data is also a necessary piece. When you have data that's located somewhere else, why recreate it? Just bring it in. So let's take a look at attaching documents to records just to refresh you. I have a table in my zoo database that is called Animal Inventory. When I open this up, I see that I have a document attached. It's in the 97/2003 Word format. If I go into Design View, I see that my data type is special. It's an OLE object, Object Linking and Embedding. In order to attach this document, I can do so in the table. I can either right-click and choose Insert Object, or I can go into the associated form and do the same thing. Let's go into the associated form because this is probably where your users will be working with information. This shows the actual contents of that Word document instead of just showing that there's a link and that a user needs to double-click on it. I'll right-click and choose Insert Object. From here, I can also create new, or I can create from File. I'm going to browse out to where that document is located. And here I have a polar bears document. Okay. Okay. And it's going to refresh and show the contents of that document. In order to import information, that's on your External Data tab. You have this whole import area. You simply have to know where your data is located. You can import from an Access database. You can import from Excel, SharePoint, XML, a text file, or any one of these items that exists out there somewhere on your network or in your computer. These are the objectives for entering and modifying data. Let's take a look at the next set of objectives. Now we're getting into queries, creating and modifying queries. There are 4 nuggets that are associated with this: simple queries, query design, advanced queries, and calculate with a query. The idea behind a query is you get to take your information from a bunch of tables that are related together, pull them into one query, and also add criteria. So instead of having to view 10,000 records, you can just view the 150 records that are related to the information that you really need to see, to understand, or to display to your audience. As far as queries go, they have their own section. I have a few different queries. I've got an append query, I have a crosstab query, a delete query, and I have a make table query as well. The rest are select queries, which do not make changes, and they're referred to as select versus an action query. These are the most common types. How do you create a query? Back to the Create ribbon. Here, you're going to choose the other area and either let the wizard walk you along or go into Query Design, where you choose the source of your data. Let's take a look at food name and animal name. And then we can click the Run button, and we see what our animals like to eat. Of course, you could save your query. I'm not going to right now. Let's go back to these exam objectives. Presenting and sharing data. Here we can sort and filter data so that we don't have to look at everything that exists in that base table or base query. So we can look at our simple forms and our simple queries nugget to feel comfortable with criteria, basic sorting, and basic filtering. Creating and modifying charts was covered in our advanced reports, where we created a pivot chart. Export data in the Save As file type is covered in the external data. If we take a look back in Access, we see that we can open up the animal form, and if we wanted to sort or filter, we could right-click and choose to sort. We could choose text filter and just see everything that begins with a certain character or does not equal fish or equals fish or contains fish in that. We also have the filter controls and the sort controls up here, and you can get very much into specific criteria. If you filter by form, you can really choose the value that you'd like to filter by. You have the and criteria here, but you can also have some or criteria. I'd like to see everything that is either steak or watermelons. When I click this, now I can see the various records that exist in my animal food order form. I can remove this filter by clicking that button, and the other item that was covered here, that's a macro that I had. Another item that was covered here was exporting. On the external data, You simply select what it is that you'd like to export and choose the location of where you'd like to export it to. Excel, Word, TextPad, SharePoint is big here in Access 2007. That's a special server that you'll have to set up in your network where you can collaborate with many different types of data. PDF is a big one, being able to send your reports into a PDF or an XML paper specification file type allows you to distribute your information easily without having to send that whole Access database. Presenting and sharing data is a very big piece to understanding Access. It's really a big reason why you create that Access database after all. Managing and maintaining databases is important if you want to be a proactive administrator, if you always want your database to be optimized, in good health, and also have a large amount of uptime. So performing routine database operations and managing databases are covered in 3 nuggets: database tools, security, and external data. If we take a look at Access, we see we have a whole database tools ribbon, which allows us to analyze information to make sure Access thinks that it is performing or optimized to the best that it can be. We also can move data into a SQL Server. The specification for Access databases is 2 gigs. Once you hit 2 gigs for your database file, you need to move up into the SQL Server, which is Microsoft's enterprise-wide database. Of course, it costs a lot more money than Access 2007 or other versions of Access, but if your data is that big, hopefully your company is going to give you some cash to be able to make the best database that you can possibly make. That was the last set of objectives geared towards this MCAS Microsoft exam. I would recommend, if you're planning on taking this exam, that you start simple and maybe think of something that you find interesting. All the MP3s that you have on your computer you could throw into a database. Maybe your recipes if you like to cook. Maybe your contact lists of your friends and family. Just something that you will find interesting and maybe beneficial for your personal life as well. I mean, you could be creating a database for something at work also, but a lot of times you don't have the opportunity to start small when you're making a solution at work. My point here is sit down for a moment. You might need a piece of paper and a pencil and draw some rectangles. And those rectangles would stand for the tables. And figure out which fields should go in each table, including the primary key. How would they relate together? What data types should these pieces of data hold? How are you going to create queries to pull this information back together? And then create some tables. Put some dummy data in there, or even better, import the information if you have it somewhere else. Once you have this structure and all your table properties set up how you like them, then you're ready to get into those objects that are based off of your tables. Always start designing your tables first, but always start thinking about the data that you need to see in your reports or your output first. Sounds opposite, doesn't it? You have to know your output, but you can't get to your output until you know how you're going to design those underlying tables. Then, once you have that created, go ahead and make your forms. Figure out what your forms should look like, what fields should exist in your forms. Be sure to go into Design View and make it look pleasing on the eyes for your users and also easily accessible. Once you're through with that, then you can create those reports and again, format them, group them, organize them in a way that when your audience looks at that report, they totally understand what you're getting at. Charts are a big help in that because a chart is a visual representation of that data. And a user, a person, can just look at that and in a few seconds glean the point of your report instead of having to read through and look at all the totals and figure out which total is bigger and which is the good type of total even within your report. Access is a big, broad program, but it's been around since the early 90s, so obviously many people find this to be valuable, and I do too. I love how easy it is to use. I love how it's all held within one program, Access 2007, but it will work with all the other Office programs that I use every day, and I'm sure you and your coworkers do as well. Overall, in this nugget, we took a look at the exam objectives one by one for our MCAS 77-605 Access 2007 exam. I mapped the objectives to the nuggets, and hopefully you appreciated a few of those tips for studying that I gave you, which was really go through the nuggets, learn the details, but do a database yourself, because that always reinforces the fact that you can do it and that you understand why you're doing it in the first place. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.